Hi, my name is Jonathan de Bernhardt Wood and I'm the National Advisor for Giving and Income Generation for the Church of England, and it's a real pleasure to be with you today. And my congratulations to Paul and the team for a fantastic conference. I hope you find it a really stimulating and enjoyable time. I've been asked to talk about the different ways that the National Church goes and encourages giving and generosity in our churches, and it's a real pleasure to spend 20 minutes with you now exploring the different ways that we can help you. I want to start off though with a prayer that I actually used when I came to the Manchester conference 2 years ago, because I think it's incredibly important where we start from. We can get excited about plans and schemes and initiatives and new tools and incredible mechanisms to go and encourage giving and generosity. But it's important to remember that generosity is itself a spiritual gift. It is a gift from God. And I love this prayer of St. Anselm. I owe you more than my whole self, but I have no more. By myself, I cannot render the whole of it to you. This is the basis on all our encouragements around giving and generosity, that God will give us the gift of generosity ourselves and all that we need to encourage giving and generosity within our churches and our parishes. Before getting on to resources, I want to very quickly skip through the 10 main findings of an Anglican giving survey that we did recently. We interviewed 2,000 Anglicans to explore their behaviours and their experiences and their attitudes around giving and generosity in our churches. We interviewed and surveyed so many because we wanted to see what the difference was between people in different traditions, different sizes of churches, whether they were suburban, urban, rural churches, and where they were in the country. And one of the really striking learning points from the survey was actually there really wasn't that much difference. There was an amazing commonality of responses in all different contexts. So what did we find out? Well, we found out that most surprisingly, a third of Anglicans do not give to their church at all. And these are not occasional Anglicans. All the 2,000 that were surveyed were Anglicans who regularly go to their church at least once a month. And yet a third of them do not give to their church. We also found out that 40% of Anglicans have never been asked to give regularly. So regular giving, the bedrock of all of our churches' finances. Over £350 million is given regularly every year, and yet 40% have never been asked to give regularly either. And nearly half of Anglicans have never been asked to review their giving. This was striking when we did it, but in times of high inflation like now, it becomes even more important. We need to ask people to review their giving on a regular basis if the level of their giving is to be maintained in terms of its contribution to the church's ministry. Only half of Anglicans have heard a sermon on giving in the last 12 months, and it gets worse. Only 60% of those who had thought it changed their thinking on giving. So just getting a sermon isn't enough in itself. It's actually what that sermon does, and does it lead to meaningful change. This hints at something really important, which is around giving and generosity, which is that these subjects can be quite difficult for people. And actually, sermons are great, of course they are, but providing opportunities where people can really spend some time reflecting, praying and thinking about God's generosity to them, discovering and rediscovering that generosity is really important part of how we transform giving and generosity in our churches. Less than a third of Anglicans say they're regularly thanked for their giving. There's lots of problems with this, not least surely it's a basic courtesy, but also thanking people is the essential first step in building trust. It's a way at its most fundamental and basic that a church knows that that a giver knows that its donation has been received. But less than a third of Anglicans are saying that they're regularly thanked. The most popular motivation for giving for Anglicans is to keep the building maintained. Now, very often when we're talking about giving and generosity, understandably so, we talk about it as a discipleship thing. This is about how we rediscover God's generosity to us, and how that then inspires us to go and live a generous life. All of this is true, but actually a really big motivation for many Anglicans is the building itself. And there's a kind of nuance to this. It's about inheriting generosity from past generations in our church buildings, their beauty, the sense of sacred space, and also a sense of responsibility and obligation to ensure that we pass it on to the next generation, this kind of seamless thread of generosity through the generations. And that's a huge motivator for many Anglicans when it comes to giving. Twice as many Anglicans were asked to give by collection envelope as opposed to direct debit. And this reflected the kind of wider findings, really, which was there are new forms of giving, incredibly effective forms of giving, which we're not using as much as they could. It's striking that during the pandemic, the churches who had a higher proportion of givers on standing order or particularly direct debit survived the rigours and the horrors of the pandemic financially much better than those who were reliant on cash donations. A few other findings. Anglicans are 3 times as likely to leave a legacy to charity than they are to their church. So it's not that Anglicans actually don't like leaving legacies, they do. I mean, the thing that came through from the surveys, Anglicans are incredibly generous people, but more that they just didn't think about giving in that way to their church. There's a kind of parallel finding, which is that 1 in 2 Anglicans are used to giving online, but very few churches go and give that opportunity, or certainly did pre-pandemic. But here for this one, the legacy thing is striking. It's not that Anglicans don't leave legacies, it's not that they wouldn't, it's more that we just don't ask them to go and think about it. Only 27% of Anglicans view their church's financial needs as very important. This is the underpinning of lots of the different findings that we found. It's not that the work isn't valued and seen as important, it's just this misunderstanding of the need. Not realising that local ministry of our local churches are funded by local communities, and it's a message which need to have reiterated. And finally, to end on a positive, 49% of Anglicans feel they'd be motivated to give more if they understood the impact of their giving. Now again, there's a nuance, there's a subtlety here which is really, really important. This isn't about the cost of ministry. This is about what the ministry does. It's about what changes as a result of people's gifts. It's about the outcomes within our church ministry and particularly our wider community, that we explain the difference that giving is making, and that motivates people to give. Okay, so now on the website, Churchwing website, there's all those findings and there's all the recommendations that flow from that. So there's much, much more. You can get hold of the whole report if you really want to. There's lots in it. Which is of real value, I think, as we explore and understand how we create the best environment for giving and generosity. But those are the main findings. I also just want to touch on something again. I mentioned this briefly when I came a couple of years ago, which is the building a generous church model. And these are the 8 aspects that we need to think about as a church when we're looking at ways that we encourage giving and when we encourage generosity. So if we want to look at giving, if we want to enable giving, there's 4 things we need to get right, and they form the acronym MINT. We need to think about mechanisms, making sure that people are able to give in the ways that they want to give, particularly digitally, contactless and online, but it can also be direct debit, it can also be about legacies. There's just lots of different mechanisms, and we need to make sure that we're offering people ways to give in ways that they feel comfortable and they like. But very often when we're talking about giving, we start with mechanisms, and it's so important that we look at the I, the N and the T. Impact is hugely significant, as it said in that last finding there. If givers understood the impact of their giving, they'd be much more likely to give. So that's not cost, this is talking about the difference that we're making. But we also need to explain the need that this wonderful work, this change, this transformation that's happening in our communities is funded by local people in the local community. The need is for people to give. It's really important to articulate that and to build trust, that when people give money, it's acknowledged and appreciated, but it's spent on what we said it was going to be spent on, and that we are completely transparent in the way that we handle our money. So mechanisms, impact, need, trust, 4 aspects for enabling giving. To encourage generosity, we need to focus on inspire, disciple, embed and activate. So inspiring leadership, hugely significant, celebrating generosity when it's found in our life of our churches, discipling, providing people with the opportunity to learn more about God's generosity to them and how we can live generous lives, embedding generosity, so it's woven into our every service, every gathering, every publication. It talks of God's extraordinary generosity and where generosity is found. And then activate, that we don't just talk and reflect and encourage, but we enable people to join in and to go and live more generous lives. So that's the building a generous church model, kind of inspired in many ways by the learnings of that survey too, or re-emphasize things that were particularly important. But it's important in terms of the context to a lot of what we'll be talking about today. that actually as a church, if we want to enable giving, we need to focus on mechanisms, impact, need and trust. If we want to encourage generosity, we need to inspire, we need to disciple, we need to embed, and we need to activate. So that's the building a generous church model. And now I just want to talk about the resources that can enable all of that to happen. Now that first list there, I'm going to talk about those things in detail in a second. But just to unpack the second line there. So digital giving, we have £1 million rollout of free contactless equipment going across the Church of England, soon to hit Manchester, and indeed there's a session on that later. It's been fantastic to go and see the difference new contactless machines, new online giving has gone and made to so many churches, and it's incredibly important as we move away from cash that we embrace these digital forms of giving. So that's one aspect of the team's role. We also do our piloting, things called cornerstone workshops, which are for churches which need to increase their giving in order to fund their church's ministry. So it's all about identifying the giving gap and the ways, the actions that we can take in order to close that gap. And we also do training for clergy particularly, but also webinars for church communities on all manner and different aspects of giving and generosity and ways that they can be encouraged in our churches. But let's unpack the top line first, because that's the heart of the resources which you can use in your church context and which are freely available on the Church of England website. So first up, the Generosity Toolkit. So this unpacks the building a generous church model, the mint and the idea. And it uses the kind of methodology of appreciative inquiry, if you're familiar with that. And basically what that means is, in theological terms, that's focusing on abundance, not scarcity. It's about celebrating the generosity where it's found. One of the wonderful privileges of my job is when I can go to churches and we talk about generous stories. It's normally where I start, and I encourage churches to go, we're talking about generosity and how we grow it. Say, tell me your generous stories. Tell me how you personally have experienced generosity in your church. And the reason, there's lots of reasons for focusing on, but one of them is it's about focusing on abundance, not scarcity. It's about focusing on where God's generosity is already found. We're really good at pointing out what we're not doing or what we haven't got. But to start on let us celebrate what we have is hugely significant, and much more likely, therefore, to embrace growth and change and transformation in the future. So first of all, mechanisms is one of them, but of course there's equivalent cards for impact, need and trust. So it defines the different areas, it then discerns, so there's a kind of theological reflection on that particular issue, and then there's a series of questions which you can ask as a group, which enable you to explore this issue more. You then turn over the card and write up what you think you're doing well as a church and where you perhaps need to improve. And then there's a dream section, what could we do? And then looking at those and thinking, what's the order of importance for them? The toolkit can be done by PCCs, it can be done by small groups, it can be done by the whole church. It can be delivered remotely, but it's better done in person. There's a wide variety of different ways of being able to use it. But the idea is that it deep dives. It really allows us to go and explore the full aspects of our church's ministry through the generosity lens. And so we can see the ways that God is already working in our churches, and also the ways that God is nudging us perhaps to grow our generosity. Outcome of this, doing the toolkit, is you then have these cards which talk about, okay, what is it that we're going to do? Now, some churches have an action for each of the 8 different areas, mint or idea, but some actually just focus on one particular area because that's the key need for them as a church. So there's a wide range of different ways of using it, but that's the generosity toolkit. Next up, the giving review. So if the generosity toolkit is a deep dive, the giving review is a annual MOT. Really good within PCCs, just to touch base and just check how are we doing in terms of the ways that we go and encourage giving and encourage generosity. Again, freely available on the website to go and download. So just simple questions which you can explore. Great to do it as a PCC, because one of the things it teases out is people's different knowledge or understanding of giving and generosity, and also their different experiences too. But as I say, the toolkit is the deep dive. This is the MOT, the annual checkup, just to check how things are going. So that's also available. We've also done a thing called Generosity Week. fact, this conference perfectly timed because Generosity Week nationally starts tomorrow. The national online service is all about Generosity Week. Generosity Week, though, can happen whenever you want it to. There's an enormous range of resources which you can pick and choose according to your particular context. So there's podcasts, there's daily reflections, there's service packs, there's group activities, there's ways of engaging the wider community around giving and generosity. There are lots and lots and lots of resources available to you. So again, all freely available on the Church of England website. And do go and have a look if that's of interest. It's been fantastic to see how churches have been able to use this as an opportunity to really celebrate God's generosity to us, and indeed generosity in the life of the church and the wider community. So that's Generosity Week. And finally, just to talk about Generosity Fika 2. So this is if you are looking as a church and you're wanting to explore how you can really, again, deep dive, sink into God's generosity, to explore what God's generosity is and how it's changed us and how it can continue to transform our lives. It's half day. And as you can see there on the screen, there's participants handbooks, facilitators handbook, there are reflections on the website itself. There's a training film for facilitators. And what it does is it uses different films from across the world where God's generosity is already found. It also uses the story of Mary anointing Jesus' feet and how that illustrates 7 different ways of living a generous life. So there's opportunities to explore generosity across the world, to explore biblical generosity, to explore Mary's story and how that can inspire and encourage us. There's time to reflect and pray about God's generosity in our lives and embedding it further and how it can grow. So this is really great if you're looking at a kind of cultural change, you want to grow that generosity side, the idea side, you want to really grow as a generous community. I'd heartily recommend the Fika to you. If you're wondering about what on earth is a Fika, it's a Swedish thing and it's about coffee and it's about conversation. It can be tea as well, I should say. Coffee and tea and conversation, and gloriously, wonderfully, 7 different types of cake. So the idea is that it's a relaxed, informal, warm and friendly and encouraging atmosphere where we are encourage each other in our kind of walking the generous path of our Christian faith. So, but the Fika is there because it's all about celebrating and encouraging and enjoying. So it's a discussion based, it's a chance to explore. And again, it's great if you wish to explore that deeper within your church. Okay, so that's a very quick skip through the different resources that we're available. So we started with a prayer of St. Anselm, that call to start our praying, our thinking and our planning with prayer, that God may give us the gift of generosity and all that we need to go and live a generous life. We looked at the Anglican Giving Survey and the findings from it and all this, the striking things within it and the calls to action that there are there, and a reminder that that's available on the website along with the 10 recommendations that flow from it. There's then, we explore building a generous church, mint an idea, mechanisms, impact, need, trust. How can we grow those things so that we do our very best to enable giving in our churches? An idea, inspire, disciple, embed and activate around encouraging and growing generosity in our churches. And then a skip through the different resources that we have available to go and help you do that, whether that's Generosity Toolkit, whether it's the Giving Review, whether it's Generosity Week, or whether it's the Generosity Fika. Hopefully some, if not all of those, will be a help to you in terms of enabling giving and growing generosity in your church. As I say, beyond that other line that we had in one of the slides earlier is talking about the different training that we do and also the digital giving rollout. And as I mentioned, that's coming to Manchester very soon. And there's more information on that on a session later. So I hope that's been a helpful skip through how different resources that are available and insights from the national team. I do hope you have a fantastic conference and that you enjoy and are inspired by what you hear. And I really pray that God may bless the work that you do, and that you, through the work and the effort and the energy and the inspiration and the creativity, that God's generosity can be revealed afresh in your churches and parishes. God bless you. Thank you for listening. Take care.